Hi, and welcome to the HQ podcast. For those tuning in for the first time, the HQ is a podcast serial produced by CHA Learning and is your trusted source for conversations on healthcare issues and topics from the perspective of those that are leading and impacting the health system. Together, we'll explore these topics as we continue to learn together. CHA Learning is a professional development division of Healthcare Can and is uniquely Canada's only national fully online learning provider serving all of healthcare. So please check out more about our learning programs and services after this episode and discover how we collaborate with health leaders and organizations like those we feature on the HQ to empower healthcare professionals with the knowledge, skills, and relationships to impact health system improvement. I'm Dale Sherbeck, and thank you for joining me today for another amazing conversation. Notwithstanding how commonly AI continues to come up in our discourse about almost anything these days, the advent of artificial intelligence is not new. AI, in some of its early forms, has been here for a long while. But with the launch of platforms like DALL-E and ChatGPT, and even the promise of reliable self-driving cars, the technology is very quickly becoming ubiquitous for many people. And for many, it is inspiring thoughts of what if, and can it do this? And with each new success and announcement, we are left wondering if it can solve some other impossible problem and improve all parts of life. For those behind the scenes, however, AI and its promise is not only not new, it is something they have been working to build for years, are increasingly integrating into healthcare. But what is the promise of AI for healthcare? What does it mean? How are we already using it? What could it solve or change? What impact could it have on some of our data challenges? Can it solve something as pernicious as our current HHR crisis? Could it be that most wonderful of healthcare fixes, the cure-all, the ultimate panacea? Or choose your novel or movie. Does it represent a dystopian beginning where machines take over the world, disrupt cultures, or threaten our very existence? And while I've personally long been fascinated by such dystopian narratives, my goal in this episode is to get beyond the science and the fiction and the fantasy, beyond the myths and the hyperbole, and have a balanced conversation with someone who not only understands, but who is leading this work, who can discuss the challenges, yes, but who ultimately can bring us hope. With that, let me introduce you to Dr. Mamdani. Dr. Mamdani is the Vice President of Data Science and Advanced Analytics at Unity Health Toronto and Director of the University of Toronto Temerity Faculty of Medicine Centre for Artificial Intelligence Research and Education in Medicine, or TCARM as it's called. Dr. Mamdani's team bridges advanced analytics, including machine learning, with clinical and management decision-making to improve patient outcomes and hospital efficiency for over 50 AI solutions developed and deployed into clinical practice. He holds several degrees, including a Doctor of Pharmacy from the University of Michigan and a Master of Public Health degree from Harvard University, with a concentration in quantitative methods focusing on biostats and epidemiological principles. Beyond these, Dr. Mamdani holds several other degrees, appointments, and titles. So please check out the rest of his truly impressive bio we've shared in our show notes, which is why, not surprisingly, in 2010, he was named among Canada's top 40 under 40. Hi, Mohammed. Welcome to the HQ, and thank you for joining us to help us better understand what AI may mean to healthcare.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I've been looking forward to having this conversation since we started the HQ, trying to find somebody who could really unpack this topic for us, and because it is something that we continue to hear a lot about in all parts of our lives. So when we say AI or machine learning, there are perhaps a generation of two listeners whose mind go to things like Skynet, others go to things like Siri or ChatGPT. But to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, can we perhaps start with what is AI and what is it not?
Yeah, artificial intelligence is a very, very broad term. The term's been around for decades and decades, so it's not a really new term.
Hmm.
And AI, what people often refer to as AI, is when machines start mimicking human behavior. So they start doing things that we as humans can do. In its essence, though, AI is really about learning about complex relationships in data. That's really what AI is about.
Hmm.
So when we process things as human beings, for example, we're always ingesting data. If you really think about it, right? Like, how do humans function? Well, we function through our five senses, right? We can see things, we can hear things, we can touch, taste. We've got five of these senses that are constantly ingesting data. And we're processing that data to realize, oh, we're seeing a picture of a cat, or what we're hearing is a ball bouncing, or something else. What
Hmm.
we touch is feeling slimy. Those are all data points that we're ingesting into our brain to really make us have a sense of the world, right?
Right.
So if you take that analogy to computers and machines, how do they do the same things? They're going to have to ingest data, figure out all these complex relationships in data to create a reality. That's what AI typically does.
Cool. So where is that going to take us? You know, among several burning platforms, some might say that we have a data problem. So we have too much of this data that's coming through all of our senses and everything else that we have to collect it for us. So, I mean, how would you respond to that? I mean, do we have a data problem? And perhaps, if I can ask your permission to sort of beg the question, what is the role for AI in healthcare around this data?
Yeah, I think we've always had a data problem for sure. Certainly in healthcare, we tend to be data rich. So we're always generating data on our health, right? Whether it be through changes in our voice patterns or our vital signs, or changes in how our hands move, for example. Um, in hospitals, in particular, that's where I'm based.
Hmm.
We often hook up patients to our monitors. We poke patients and take their blood and look at results on their lab tests. We check their heart rate. We're often looking at all sorts of other data points in order to help us make decisions. Because when a patient's sick, we try to find out why they're sick. And how we find out why they're sick are through things like lab tests, vitals, social history, family history, medical imaging tests, all those sorts of things to figure out, why is this person feeling the way they are? And then we take all of that information, and again, we're very data rich at that end,
Hmm.
and we try and process it in our heads. And we have limitations, right? So when we're
Hmm.
looking at an X-ray, we're limited to what the eye can see. As a radiologist, you can only see what the eye can see. Now, of course, you get computers to assist you and stuff in terms of quote unquote seeing better, but you're able to only see what you see. When we make a diagnosis, we process a lot of data. In many cases, the diagnosis can be very complicated. In some cases, it's actually pretty simple,
Hmm.
but in many cases, the diagnosis is fairly complex. And I think something we have to remember is, in many cases, a diagnosis is not a firm, this is what you have. A diagnosis is an opinion, right? It's an opinion of a person who's tried to collect the data points he or she needs to make an educated guess of what you have.
Hmm.
So when we look at the buckets of what clinicians do with all of this data, we do three primary things, maybe a fourth thing. The three primary things are diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment.
Hmm.
And some will say the fourth is communication. When we're making a diagnosis, I'm going to use a common example like asthma.
Yeah.
It turns out, there are several studies to show this, that about a third of patients who have been diagnosed with asthma don't have asthma. Over half of patients who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia actually don't have schizophrenia. Right? So, how good are we at assembling all of this data and making accurate diagnoses? I would say in some cases, not very good. In other cases, quite good.
Hmm.
What about prognosis? When we decide this patient has this sort of a diagnosis, we're often then left to, all right, well, what do I manage them with? But first, before I pick my treatment, I'm going to have to figure out how poorly the patient's going to do. If they're aggressively going to do badly, I'm going to be very aggressive in my management, right? I don't have time to lose.
Hmm.
But if they're okay, I might choose a different treatment. Maybe it has less side effects, may not work as well, but it kind of won't make the patient feel as bad. Um, so how do I know how a patient's going to do? We prognose all the time, right? As human beings, we prognose on lots of other things. For example, the weather. We try and figure out what the weather's going to be like. And we're not very good at that either. But in
Hmm.
terms of prognosis, how good are we at prognosis? Well, the reality is that we're not very good. Uh, we've done a study at our own institution where we've collected data on over 3,000 clinician predictions, where we've asked doctors, nurses, and residents, this active patient that you're seeing, do you think they're going to die or go to the ICU during the hospital stay? And when they said yes, they were right less than a third of the time. So we tend to struggle with these sorts of tasks, and it's very complicated. Like, how can you really know when a patient's going to die? In some cases, it may be obvious, but in many cases, it's really not.
Hmm.
And then we go over to treatment. We go over to treatment around things like depression. When we look at how we manage depression, oftentimes we're left with 15, 20 different drugs to choose from. How do you think clinicians choose drugs? In many cases, it's based on, well, I'm used to using these three, and maybe we'll try this one. Or the
Hmm.
drug rep that came in 6 months ago told me about this new one. I'm going to try it and let's see what happens. Call the patient back in 2 to 4 weeks. Maybe they've done well, maybe they haven't. If they haven't, we try something else. So, rationally, there must be a better way to do this, right? We have over 30 million studies that have been published in health sciences. A new study is published every minute. As human beings, how is it possible to even begin to assimilate all that information and make optimal decisions? It is really hard. They say the average complex medical decision involves considering hundreds of parameters. There's one quote that says 1,000 parameters, but it considers hundreds of parameters, right?
Hmm.
And Miller from the 1950s, who's a famous psychologist, was able to show us that the average human can process seven plus or minus two things at the same time. So of course we're going to struggle. And what does that mean for patient care? Well, the reality is that about 1 out of 4 patients, 25% of patients who end up in a hospital will experience harm. About 12% of patients, or roughly 1 in 8 patients, will experience harm to the point where they have actually a longer length of stay or need life-saving treatments or die. That's a lot of patients.
Yes.
So we do struggle, right? Where can AI help? Well, it's all about processing data. It can siphon through so much more data than we can, so much faster than we can, that the potential is there to really radically help us do better.
So, does it? I guess part of what you're saying. I mean, what is it because we're drowning in so much data, or is it that we don't know how all the data fits together? Um, like,
It's both, right? We have a lot of data to work with. Oftentimes, we have trouble making the connections of the different data points that are there because there are so many permutations and combinations of that data
hmm.
that we then struggle with. Well, what's really going on, and how can I really help? Because I'm not really fully understanding all the data that are available. The other thing really is time. Um, and many clinicians are fantastic. If they had all the time in the world, they could probably do a very good job and figure it out. But the hundreds of demands on clinicians' time really limits you in terms of what you can do with the information that's available.
Yeah, and I guess and the more complex the case, right? The more data often is in that patient's chart, and right. So to be able to synthesize through all that at a rapid speed, I guess is part of the underlying issue.
Hmm. Yeah.
So where does AI fit into this then? I mean, how can it help? How does it impact, I guess, the data on our clinicians and our health services, and where does it come? Where's the light?
Yeah, I think it can help in many, many ways. Some of the basic ways it can help is making our workloads easier, right? There are a lot of administrative tasks, a lot of tasks that we probably shouldn't be doing as humans that machines can do for us.
Hmm.
So, for example, at our hospital, again, we've deployed over 50 of these solutions. One of them helps our nurses do better. In our nursing unit, our nursing team in the emergency department, the way they assign nurses to the different zones in the emergency department is using an automated machine algorithm, where basically there are all sorts of rules on how you assign nurses and which nurses you assign to the different zones in the emergency department. And we have quite a few nurses. We're a very busy emergency department. The problem with all these rules, and they're in for a good reason. It's to promote equity, for people to get good learning opportunities, for people to not just stick to one area, um, and to actually get to know their colleagues better. There's all sorts of rules in place. So when we ask our nurses, how much time do you spend on doing these assignments with all these complex rules? The response we get is, well, our senior nurse, a team lead, spends 90 minutes a day on Excel and paper. Our clerks spend over 2 hours a day. And when we ask, well, how often do you breach the rules? How often do you not get it right? They said, probably over 20% of the time. And that's a lot, right? Because you'll have people who say, well, I want to work with my friend, and I always work with my friend in this one unit. Well, you don't get exposed to other units, and it becomes a bit of a stressful conversation. So we developed a solution for them, and the solution basically watches our nurses. So it knows who worked where, when, with whom.
Hmm.
And it will then give you an allocation. It does a whole history scan, and it gives you an allocation for the next 4 days. Here are your assignments. And if somebody calls in sick or insists, no, I want to work with this person, you can pull up the name and say sick, or I'm going to change this. Click a button and it'll do the assignments again. And so this is 90 minutes of a senior nurse not being able to do clinical work or doing something that's more productive. We're able to get that down from 90 minutes to under a minute.
Wow.
For clerks, we were able to get that down from 2 hours a day to under 15 minutes. And our repeat rate, or error rate, sorry, in terms of how often they breach the rules, went from about 21% to about 5%. It just helps take away that responsibility that just, quite frankly, is a waste of people's time. And it
Hmm.
does it for you, and it does it better and faster. On the clinical side, it can help us make decisions. It can help us maybe identify patients who may need more of our time than others. And what do I mean by that? On our floors, we have our general internal medicine unit. We had a brilliant internist named Dr. Mal Verma, who came to us and said, we really struggle often with identifying patients who are going to deteriorate. And what I mean by deteriorate is either die or need intensive care in an ICU.
Hmm.
So the thought was that for many patients, no matter what we do, they're going to die. It's inevitable. But there's quite a few patients, if we were a bit more vigilant, we might have been able to save their life. So could we have done something better? Um, and I would argue, yeah, we could, but the doctors are not there all the time. In fact, if you look at most clinicians, the average time a physician spends face to face with a patient, less than 10 minutes a day, right? And I think I'm being very generous here. So they're doing a lot of work in the background, but they have so many other responsibilities that's not a lot of time. Nurses are there, but they're doing a million things as well. So who's watching the patient? So we have an AI algorithm called ChartWatch, which was, we have about over 3 years of experience with it now, where the whole basis of ChartWatch is to watch our patients. So the machine learning algorithm runs in the background every hour on the hour. And it's been trained on over 20,000 patients worth of data. It's learned all sorts of permutations and combinations of the data. And what it does is it considers typically over 100 parameters. Every hour it's running, and it predicts if a patient is going to die or go to the ICU in the next 48 hours. As soon as it reaches a high risk threshold, it's automated to page the medical team. And our protocol is the medical team has to come and see the patient within 2 hours of being paged. There's all sorts of care pathways. Do you increase monitoring to every 4 hours? Do you look for signs of sepsis? Think about initiating antibiotics. Um, we deployed it a little over 3 years ago, and we submitted a paper for publication just a couple months ago on this. We're seeing a 26% reduction in unplanned mortality.
Wow.
These things are helping us to save lives as well. And why? Because it's processing data and helping us make better decisions. We have lots of other algorithms that are screening our patients for people who may be having slow bleeds that we didn't know about, but the algorithm's catching it and it's alerting us to say, maybe they shouldn't be on a blood thinner because they're actually bleeding inside. We have other algorithms in our hemodialysis unit for our hemodialysis patients who are very sick because their kidneys have failed. They come to the hospital quite often. We have an algorithm that regularly reports to our clinicians. These are the high risk patients, maybe spend a bit more time with them. We're seeing an over 20% reduction in 30-day hospital admission. Um, all these because it's helping us identify patients and point to patients who may need more care than we're currently giving them. So they do better and they don't come back to a place that they'd rather not be at.
So it's helping in that prognosis phase of things that you
Mhm.
described at the beginning.
It is. And there are algorithms as well, many that are suggesting, for example, treatment strategies. We have an algorithm for our cardiac valve patients, for example. Um, Cardiac valve patients often need their blood thinned a bit because they tend to clot after that sort of a procedure. And the drug that's typically used is called warfarin, which is a pretty dangerous drug. You've got to get it just right.
Hmm.
If you dose too much of warfarin, people can bleed to death. If you dose too little, they can clot, and that can cause problems as well. So it has to be just right. And we have an AI algorithm where it's pretty small data, but our data are suggesting at least a 20 to 30% improvement in dosing. With the AI helping us dose a lot better for our patients, so it's helping in the treatment phase as well.
Wow, that's all of those examples are amazing and have huge impacts on
Mhm.
patient quality care and and outcomes, I'm sure. So I mean, just I don't know if I can ask the question. So, I mean, you described like with the chart watch that you started it with, I think, 20,000 cases or so. You've had many more cases over the 3 years since then. So, does that data then go back into feeding the algorithm? I mean, is it learning from its mistakes or its successes?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't done a lot of there are machine learning models, which kind of learn and adapt as you go, and they're machine learned models,
Hmm.
which you've learned. Now you're going to deploy it, and then maybe later you'll revisit and retrain it. We've done machine learned models because it's a lot safer, and we feel much more comfortable that we know what we're going to get.
Right.
As a machine learning model adapts and it changes its performance, what we're worried about is those models, if they're not carefully watched, maybe they learn bad things
Hmm.
and then they start giving out predictions that are more harmful than beneficial. So the approach we take is we're going to do a machine learned model. We're going to see how it goes. And then over the next few years, if we need to retrain, we'll retrain on the new data. There are obviously challenges because now that data that you have has been intervened on.
Hmm.
And so it's not the same as what you trained on. And that can be challenging to retrain. It's called a feedback loop issue in the machine learning world. But what we're able to show is that actually, in many cases, maybe it's okay to actually use that data.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, I mean, you've talked a little bit about developing these different models. I think, and the impacts that they have. So, can we just sort of walk through the process a little bit more about, um, what, how do you develop some of these algorithms? I guess, how do you determine what is the right project, right? What is the right problem that you want to fix? And what will you take on? What won't you take on as part of your team?
Hmm. Yeah, we have a fairly standardized intake process, and our intake process really focuses on the end user. So we typically don't work with pure researchers. We typically don't work with pure data scientists. The people we target are frontline staff and decision makers. So these are people who are seeing patients day in and day out. They may not know anything about AI or administrative decision makers, for example. They may not know anything about AI, but they certainly know what the problems and the challenges are. And they have to be passionate about those challenges. We usually like to take on problems where the end user comes to us and says, it is ridiculous how we do this. It would vastly make a difference to how I practice, to our patients, to the administrative decision makers, decisions that I make. It would vastly improve how I do things if I could use AI. We then ask the end users to explain to us, give us the magnitude of the problem. How big of a problem is it? Then tell us how you think AI will be able to fix it for data. Then tell us what the outcomes are. So, what
Hmm.
outcomes are you going to impact after we've developed a solution and you've intervened? What sort of an impact are we looking at on what outcome? And your outcomes are limited. So, there's an outcome section in our intake form, and the choices are death, readmission, length of stay, human effort, cost, and there's a little box that says other. And if you click other and that's the only box you click, you're typically deprioritized. So we're very focused on the outcomes that we're going to hit. The next section then asks by how much. You've checked off mortality. How much are you going to drop it by? 10%? Great. That's what we'll hold you to. Because when we develop our solution and we deploy it, we need to see that 10% drop in mortality. Otherwise, we're wasting time and resources. So then we do an evaluation after we deploy, and we see if we actually meet what we had said we would do. And if we don't meet it, we would sunset the solution or really, really try and revisit why we are not getting the outcomes we expected to see. Um, the other thing that's really important is the engagement. So the end users can tell us, oh, this is a really big problem, but they have to attend all of our meetings. In fact, they lead many of our meetings. So the thought here is great, wonderful idea. We meet every 2 weeks for the next 6 to 12 months, however long it takes to develop a solution. You'll be at every one of those meetings because this is your project that you're passionate about and you think will change practice. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be using it. And you need to convince your unit, your colleagues, that this is important to do as well. In fact, for many of our projects, we require the entire group to be very enthusiastic about it and to support it. Otherwise, we won't take on the project. So, what we decide on in terms of what's important and what to tackle is driven by people, everyday people who are struggling with problems all the time. They're the ones who are driving our solution development because we know there's a need then.
So you're not just hired guns or consultants that come in and fix problems for other people, right? I think is what you're describing. You're working with them, alongside them, facilitating, I guess, some of their own problem solving in some respects.
Absolutely. And we're actually co developing a solution with them.
Yeah.
And what we commit to is that we will not only develop the solution, we will help you deploy it, and we're going to monitor it and evaluate it to make sure we're getting the outcomes. And if anything happens, if a data pipeline fails or the model starts kind of losing its performance, we're going to keep an eye on that because we need to make sure that these models are being used appropriately.
So, I mean, you've talked about decision making, several times through this conversation so far. Um, and those that are in leadership roles or decision making capacity. So, I mean, how does a machine making decisions or informed decisions like this impact the way a leader comes to work or does their work, as a result of this? I mean, does it does it remove some of their accountability? Does it change their role? Maybe just what has been your
Mm.
experience at Unity with this?
Yeah, our experience has been that these end up being assistants um, in many cases. So the vast majority of our solutions are what are called human in the loop solutions,
Hmm.
where basically the humans at the end of the day make the ultimate calls and decisions, right?
Okay.
Like the nurse, for example, who will receive the assignments. Ultimately, the computer doesn't say you have to work in this zone. Ultimately, the lead nurse will say, yeah, okay, I agree with this, or no, I'm going to change this here and there. And then they'll do the assignments. The clinician, the chart watch example that I gave, when it predicts if somebody's going to die or go to the ICU, ultimately the clinician has to sit back and say, okay, I agree with it. Maybe I missed something, or I'm going to check this patient out. Or they can say, no, 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 I just saw the patient an hour ago. I think that's wrong. Um, so it ends up being an assistant to the end user. rather than actually replacing them per se. Now, there's other tasks, especially automation tasks, where I do think that we're going to need fewer people doing them. But that's an opportunity for people to actually learn new skills, to
Yeah.
be able to do other things that are much more productive and useful.
Yeah. More a value based approach to,
Absolutely.
yeah. Very, very interesting. So, I mean, you've given me a few examples already in terms of your discussions, like with the chart watch and scheduling in your emergency department. But maybe broaden that out a little bit further here for us. I mean, how do you translate all this AI into practice in other respects?
Yeah, I think translating is a whole other beast. We see a lot of research in the AI space in healthcare, but very few models in the research space will actually be deployed into clinical practice because the clinical practice models, the production models, I guess you could say, are very different from the research models. So, what does that mean? We have pretty lengthy conversations with our end users to say the algorithms are not going to be perfect. AI is not perfect because it will train on what has happened in the past, and we've made imperfect decisions in the past. But so it'll get it wrong sometimes. How often will it get it wrong? We don't know. But if you're a clinician and it gets it wrong 1 out of 3 times, 2 out of 3 times, 7 out of 8 times, at what point do you say, I don't want to use this, that it's not very helpful to me? If it misses 20% of patients, is that okay? How much can it miss before you say, I don't trust it anymore? Getting a sense of clinicians or administrative decision makers in terms of what they're comfortable with, what a tool would look like that they could use becomes really important because then that sets some of the thresholds for our models, for example. It sets how we're actually going to interpret the results, how we're going to portray the results to the end user, and how quickly we do it because it has to be at the point of care for many of the things we do. So, all of these logistics around what is going to be a good end user experience? How does it fit into your workflow? The timeliness, all of those things really are driven by our end users because they're going to be the ones to use it. That's why they're so critical in this space. We're also pretty pragmatic in understanding that a data scientist can't do all of this. So we have 4 teams at our institution. The first team is data integration and governance, and they focus on it's composed of data engineers, ETL developers, modelers, architects. They focus on getting the data out of our many systems. How do I get data out? How do I make sure it's clean enough to go into a machine learning algorithm? Because a lot of the data is pretty dirty. But how do I do it all in real time? Then our second group says, all right, we figured out the data piece. That's the advanced analytics team. They do the modeling. They build the neural networks, the machine learning models, the optimization models. They do the model building. But I can tell you, most clinicians will not understand machine learning output. So our third group takes the machine learning model results and turns it into a product. They're the product development team. That team is actually headed up, interestingly enough, by an artist. He's a musician
Hmm.
who went and did a Master of Science in Applied Computing and another master's, and I'm going to get this wrong, in human technology interaction and media as well. So his whole passion is to get a sense of how do humans interact with AI. And in his group, he has people of expertise in design, human factors, in software development to create a solution that people would actually want to use. And of course, you can have a solution, but you can't take a horse to water. Sorry, you can't make it drink.
Yeah.
So, how do you actually then deploy the solution in a meaningful way and do proper change management? That's the fourth team, product management and deployment. So, they focus on getting the solution in, being on the floors, educating, doing change management to make sure that a solution not only gets deployed, but it sticks. And they're also responsible for evaluation. So these 4 groups work together from idea, which is brought in by the end user, to the data, to building the model, to creating a solution, to deploying it and evaluating it.
Hmm. And I just, I'm I'm trying to visualize some of this myself. So I'm assuming that most of the people who are part of these teams and working on these different discrete parts of your life cycle. I mean, they weren't. It's not like those aren't degrees that you just get out of university. Like
Mhm,
they're having to reinvent it or apply it in a different way to do something that's unique. This
mhm.
isn't cookie cutter stuff, I'm guessing.
No, it's not. After a while, some of the projects start to look a bit more familiar, so it gets to be a little bit cookie cutterish. But there's such a variety of problems to tackle, and there's such a variety of methods that can be used to tackle those problems that we don't really have a problem with boredom. um, there's uh, there's lots of variety.
Huh. And that third stage there around the right, the developing the product for the end user, I guess, where you talked about the artist involved. So, I mean, is that where we would also describe things like data visualization,
Mhm.
right? About how do we present data in a meaningful, useful sort of way?
Absolutely. Yeah. What are the types of graphs that resonate with people? What about colors, fonts? Those sorts of things are handled by the product development team.
Hmm, fascinating stuff. So,
Mhm.
um, I guess so. With some of these tools that you've deployed and the successes that you've seen, I'm sure it's inspired many. So what does it take to build out an initiative or branch as you have? Like, I mean, if somebody was wanting to listen to this and you've described these four teams, I mean, I guess, yeah, what does it take? I mean, who came up with this idea and where, how do you scale this or spread it to others? If somebody wants to go and develop an AI advanced analytics team in their healthcare organization, how do they do that?
Mhm. Well, I think it takes a bit of um, it takes a bit of thinking around how you structure this, right? And it takes resource because to assemble a team of people with different skill sets, it's going to be a bit difficult to do, but also you need resources in order to do it. So, and also too, you need permissions in a very conservative healthcare environment. So with healthcare, we're used to saying no to pretty much everything. We're overworked, we're overstretched. How do you create capacity and permissions for a team like this to do what they need to do? Unity Health, we're very fortunate. We have 9 strategic pillars. 3 of them are core strategic pillars. AI is one of those core strategic pillars.
Wow.
So, right from the board of directors to the CEO throughout the entire organization, AI is a priority. We're the only healthcare organization in the country that I know of that has AI as a core strategic pillar. And I don't know of any other organization in the world that has declared it as a strategic pillar. But that for us is a priority. What that means is we put resources behind it. And I have a team of 30 people. Those 30 people are the ones who are actually engaging with end users, doing data work, doing modeling work, developing solutions, deploying them. It's a bit of a little village that needs to be built to do it responsibly. Now, does everybody need to do this? No, I don't think everybody needs to do this. I think organizationally, people have to make a decision of whether they're an innovator or an adopter.
Hmm.
If you're an adopter, well, you're not creating solutions, you're simply adopting them, you're using them. Whether you're an early adopter, mid adopter, or late adopter, it's not that you have to create it on your own. And it's okay to be an adopter. But if you're an innovator, you're going to need a lot more. You're going to need your own infrastructure. Um, some would say you can purchase it from companies and such. I would strongly suggest that unless there's a ridiculous amount of flexibility, you create your own. Um, you're going to need data scientists who are inquisitive and who are pretty advanced. You're going to need a fail first mentality to say it's okay to fail because not all of your projects will succeed, and your organization has to be okay with resources that may end up going to failures. And you have to have the mindset of I'm actually going to build products that will be obsolete. And you have to be comfortable with that. Reason why is because if I'm innovating, I'm the first in the world to develop something. I'm going to keep innovating. I want to put my resources to the next new thing. There's going to be companies, people who are just going to be building what I built better and faster. And I won't have the time, energy, or interest to keep one upping groups. And really, that's not exciting. So, would I like to have a solution that outperforms mine? I'm the first one who built it, but there's others who've iterated on it and made it much better. Absolutely. I'd rather adopt theirs. So, I'm going to let mine go because now it frees up resource for me to work on the next new thing. That mindset's a bit tough. It's tough to sell to healthcare organizations that are strapped, right?
Yeah, but it's courageous though, right? You have to put aside your ego, I guess, to accomplish that.
I think you've hit on the fundamental word, courage. A lot of organizations will not have the courage to do this. And again, that's okay. Because what it also means is not only having the organizational buy-in, the resources that you put into this, the vision to get it through, but also to have very conservative practices like privacy, folks who do not know the legislation typically, to say it's okay to do this. It's okay to enable people to have access to data to build solutions that are going to help save their lives.
So it sounds like you have a remarkable culture at Unity that's allowed for this to happen. I don't know, in terms of your own, part in this, but where's the big bang in that, right? That moment that someone said we need to do this, or how does that all start? Where does that leadership role or come from?
Yeah, I think exactly as you said, that leadership, where does it come from? I think it comes from a vision. It comes from people saying it's the right thing to do, that we are going to take a risk. We're going to be courageous. We're going to be okay if it fails, as long as it doesn't harm anyone. We put proper guardrails around it. There's proper governance around it.
Hmm.
We're okay to fail. And I'm going to be courageous enough to say, I'm going to take a failure as long as I can get some wins. And just to give you a sense, our success to failure ratio, if I had to guess, it would be about 70% of our projects succeed, 30% fail. Now, if we look at the digital health startup world, 97% of digital health startups fail.
Yeah, I was going to say that those odds are pretty good for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
but again, how do we know it's 70-30? Well, because we've done it. Most
yeah.
organizations won't even have the courage to even try it.
So, I mean, speaking of some of the risks that you talk about the courage to fail and to try to innovate in this space, and accepting that not everything's going to work the way you intend it. So, and you've talked about privacy and getting them on board. So, I mean, I know we're not talking Skynet here and these computers taking over the world, but there are inherently some risks involved in taking on some of these things. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what those are, and how you've managed some of those things along the way. Like governance, privacy, confidentiality.
Mhm. Yeah. So we actually do have a governance framework around how we manage these sorts of projects, steering committees, oversight, that sort of thing. Our data scientists have signed several confidentiality, several sets of confidentiality agreements. So we are protected in that way. We do have a leadership that actually really backs us up and fuels us in terms of what we do. But certainly, I would say that there's quite a bit of effort that needs to be placed in terms of the safeguards that are in play. Our environment, for example, that runs all of our data, that runs our machine learning models, is all internal behind our firewalls. So our security is security of the hospital, their IT folks. Now, some people would say, well, you need to go on the cloud. I would say, I'd love to go on the cloud. But when we're ready and when our folks are comfortable to say it's okay to actually have a hybrid environment, for example, and they've done the vetting through security and privacy considerations. So we really adhere to current practices of the hospital in terms of privacy and security. Ethics, we have an ethics lead at our hospital that we consult with as well. We engage patients in what we do where relevant. Um, so several of our projects have actually had patient engagement. Again, we go back to evaluating. We are very, very, very focused on evaluation. So if there's something that's negative happening, we need to know about it. If there's something positive that's happening, that's fantastic. But we're more concerned about not doing any harm. And we have, again, a very strong evaluation culture to say, all right, let's just make sure that first and foremost, we're not harming anyone. And
Hmm.
if for whatever reason, fortunately, we've been quite lucky so far. If for whatever reason something results in harm, we catch it early, we stop it.
It's great to hear. So, what about some of the other, I guess, risks that might be facing? I mean, you've talked about security a little bit. Obviously, in healthcare, we are increasingly talking about things like cybersecurity threats, and it's not that uncommon for us to hear about, a hospital who's had to shut down for a period of time because they've been hacked. So, w- what kind of threats do those things play on some of these kinds of tools? And somebody going in and changing the code of one of your algorithms or something.
Yeah, I think obviously there's going to be concerns around if somebody hacks in or changes algorithms and such. I don't think it's unique to AI though. It
Okay.
could be relevant to practically every other thing we do at a hospital. So, for example, what if somebody hacks in and changes lab results for our patients,
Yeah.
or changes vital signs or something? I don't know why they would, but let's say they do. Same sort of risks there, right? So, really adhering to the risk framework, the risk mitigation framework, and strategies of the hospital becomes really important for us to minimize these risks.
And in terms of other risks, I mean, I've certainly heard conversations with other people leading in the AI space, talking about the development of different algorithms and AI as it relates to our own implicit bias, our our you know our prejudices, right? So where do some of these things come into the work that you're doing, or how do you address those as it relates to bias, equity, ethics, in terms of the work that you're doing, and that we're not just creating tools that are just you know perpetuating, I guess, the worst of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, there's several other concerns as well in terms of bias, for example, ethics. There's also over reliance on these algorithms that can be problematic as well. But in terms of the bias part, I think we have to be very pragmatic, very practical in terms of how we approach bias and equity. And what do I mean by that? Um, we're able to understand bias in algorithms, um, in but we're limited to the data that we have.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm going to use the chart watch example. Do we know if the algorithm performs just as well among young versus old? Yes, we do, because we have age data. What about males versus females? Yes, we have sex data. Sick versus not so sick? Yep, we've got data on diseases and comorbidities and such. What about race? Do we have data on race? No, we don't. So can we tell you that our algorithm performs just as well among one race versus the other? We can't. And that's a bit concerning because in the US, for example, there was a study that looked at racial bias in a major health insurer because they were using an algorithm that would actually direct resources to certain patients. And they found the algorithm was biased against Black people. So what happens now is instead of humans being biased, now you've got a machine that's magnifying the bias because you can just expose it to so many other people. And
Yeah.
that's a big problem. So at our hospital, we don't have race data. Do we have gender data? No, we don't. There's over 100 genders. So at what point do we say it's good enough? And sometimes it's a judgment call, sometimes it's ethical. Because is there any guidance to say you need 40 bias assessments? I don't know of any. And I can tell you, if I did 40 bias assessments on 40 different parameters, and I went to a conference or presented somewhere, somebody in the audience would say, what about 41, 42, and 43? I did 100, somebody would say 101, 102, 103. At what point do you stop? At what point is it reasonable to say, I think it's good enough? And they are judgment calls, right? So we deployed CharWatch. We didn't have race data. So arguably, you could say, well, shouldn't you have waited for race data to make sure it wasn't biased amongst race? And the argument in retrospect, now I can say would be, we can take the algorithm down. We can wait for race data and we can let 26% more people die every year. What's more ethical? So these are very, very difficult conversations with not really any straight answers. And I think before we jump to the bandwagon of you have to have extensive analyses in all these areas, I would say we have to be pragmatic in our approaches. We have to do the best we can. We have to keep monitoring after we deploy and make sure that the algorithms are actually functioning in a just, equitable manner to the best of our ability.
Yeah, so I partly, I guess what I'm hearing as well is that it is still fundamentally a tool, right? And we still need to equip our leaders, clinicians, and others within the system with that, other moral compass and right the other principles about equity, diversity, inclusion, and so that I guess they themselves become safeguards, I guess to some degree for the tool itself.
hmm Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think what ends up happening is um, the clinicians, and we've been able to show this in a paper as well, is that when you actually have AI algorithms running by themselves, um, they perform okay. Clinicians by themselves, they perform okay, but when you combine the two together, they perform much better than either one alone. And so it's a matter of, I would say, kind of safeguarding, but more just the machine and the humans working together
Yeah.
to make better, more optimal decisions. Because I would say in some cases the AI safeguards against human error.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So
Mhm.
better together.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, I mean, with the success of the work that you're doing, and as you've described, you're a unique engine in this country in terms of that you've prioritized this as a core principle at Unity. How did you accelerate, spread, or scale this work to other organizations in Ontario, in Canada, around the world? And I guess I'm wondering as well, is you know, yes, you've got a team of 30 people, which is big in some regards, and minuscule in the grand scheme of things. Um, you know, is it best to develop teams like this in other jurisdictions and organizations across the country and all be working, repeating, their work, perhaps sharing it in other mechanisms? Um, or is there another way to, to do this nationally?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we failed actually trying to deploy one of our solutions to other hospitals. As a public hospital, you can imagine our interest is at our hospital because that's who pays our bills and we support our patients. Now, how do we actually get our solutions outside? We had a solution that predicts emergency department volumes. So the solution is actually it's kind of neat. It was based on 4 years of historical data at the time when we built the model. It scraped the web for weather data. So, for example, is there a snowstorm happening tomorrow night? We also have city planning data like long weekends and such. And so all this data goes into an algorithm and it predicts how many patients are going to come to our emergency department in the next 7 days. So today's Monday, we can tell you Wednesday from noon to 6, there'll be 82 patients waiting in the emergency department. 10 of them will have mental health issues, 12 of them will be hard to treat, the rest will be easier. The accuracy at that level is typically around in the mid 90s, 90%,
Wow.
which is great, right? Because it helps for planning. Now, of course, we present this at a conference. We've deployed it at our own hospital. Other hospitals come up to us and say, hey, we want this too. And we say, wonderful, we would love for you to have it because all hospitals should have it for planning. Now, of course, what happens is we say, all right, great, here's our code. And the hospitals say, well, we don't understand Python or R because that's what we program in. And we say, okay, we get it. You're not data scientists, you're a hospital. Why don't you send us your timestamp data? There's no personal health information on it. Just that's what we need. And we'll geolocate the weather data and all that sort of stuff to your hospital. And we'll, on a daily basis, we'll give you the results. And they said, terrific. Of course, we send the machine learning output, say we can't understand machine learning output because we're hospitals. And then we develop their dashboards for them. And we quickly realize that we're now their IT help desk. So it becomes unsustainable. And
Yeah.
of course, we get questions from our leadership to say, why are you spending time, energy, and money on resources for those hospitals when they're not giving you anything back and you have stuff to do at our hospital? Seems hardly fair. So this is where we gave up and we said, this is unsustainable. It's not practical. We can't do it. So we, uh, through a collaboration with Tomi Putinen, we launched Signal One in April 2022, which is a startup.
Hmm.
They were able to raise money fairly rapidly, and they focus on how do you take some of these solutions and deploy them into other settings. Um, so we believe that there has to be some sort of engagement with private sector. How can we do this more broadly on a national scale, on a provincial scale? I think we need centers for innovation. We need people or groups that will push the agenda to create new solutions. And I would argue that in every province, you have one or two, maybe three, depending on the size of the province, innovation centers for AI in medicine. They're constantly developing new things. They're actually then set up an environment where you can have startups, where you can have people who actually take solutions and can bring it to the rest of the healthcare system. But the healthcare system says because we're investing, well, we get favorable costs out of it in terms of solution development. We also have adopters that we realize in the system to say, here's the innovation centers, here are the adopters. How can we actually work through either through startups or private sector, or simply purchasing solutions and having an environment set up for maintenance to be able to create an ecosystem that innovates and adopts in an accelerated manner relative to all other countries worldwide?
Wow. So, I mean, is there a role for, I guess, our governments in this? Do you like different
Absolutely.
departments, agencies? We just had a previous episode about talking about the lack of investment in our research sector of healthcare.
Mhm.
So the Tri Council was mentioned there. Is it ISED? You know, is it other kinds of granting? Is it CADIT because you're dealing with tools and devices in some respects, right? So, what are your thoughts in terms of where does this need to come from?
Absolutely. I mean, I think governments certainly have a role to play if they choose. I think private sector has a role to play. The public healthcare system has a role to play. Many of us have a role to play. But the one thing that I would say, even more than vision, that we need to have is courage, as you'd mentioned previously. I just don't know if we have the courage to do this because it's new, it's scary, it's innovative, it's different. We're just so comfortable with saying, why change? The status quo is good enough.
Yeah.
We need the courage to break that mindset. Once we have a sense of this is the future, this is where we need to think things through, we need vision. And not a theoretical pie in the sky vision. We need practical operational vision that will be able to say, here's what we would like to see, here's how we can do it. And we need to be able to resource it. So in the ideal world, I would love for us to have courage to say across the board, whoever that owner is, let's say it's the Ministry of Health in Ontario or Ontario Health or whomever, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have resources to do this. Here's the model for how it's going to be done. Let's say in Ontario, I'm going to have 4 centers of excellence or innovation that will not be purely research focused because we don't want just research out of this. We want application. It's a very different mindset to do applied work. Research is a very different mindset. So I want applied work, not research. Because if
Yeah.
you get a bunch of researchers in the room, but as an advisor group, you'll end up with a research environment. We don't need that.
Fair.
So I'm going to do this. I'm going to have it applied, and I'm going to build an ecosystem where I can get product out of it that I can then take to the rest of the world. Oh, and by the way, if I'm funding all this, that ecosystem, where now I've got product, I'm going to get a very good rate on it for the rest of the province. So this is it's a that Ontario as a society, as a community, can benefit from our innovation.
Let's hope. Let's very much hope. So um, let's hope somebody's listening and decides to follow up on that. Because I mean, we're all hungry for solutions, it seems, right, to some common problems. And a lot of those problems seem to be related to the data that we've talked about at the outset of this.
Mhm.
So one of the problems I guess that we're struggling with, and I'm just curious as to your insights and thoughts on that, is our so-called health human resource crisis, right? The issue about how many people, where do they need to be deployed, right? Uh, what work should they be doing? We don't have enough health human resources in our system right now to do the work that's being expected, and there's more work that's being demanded. So you've talked about some things, I guess, around the edges within Unity that you've been using AI that obviously has an impact on staffing. Um, what are your thoughts in terms of a role for AI as it deals with this larger issue that we're really grappling with right now?
Yeah, I think AI can play several roles in terms of health human resources. One is again easing the workload, the burden for our clinicians, our administrative decision makers. The kind of understanding is that we're always told to do more, do
Hmm.
more, do more. Well, we're already doing. We're already working the job of two people or three people. We can't do more. We need something transformational, not incremental. Because the incremental, our backs are already broken. So now what do you do that's transformational? I think we can actually use AI to take away a lot of the burden that we have currently. So, for example, people are finding a lot of benefit with AI scribes. So, we spend a lot of time documenting, putting things in electronic patient records. The administrative tasks kill people. It's just, it's so burdensome and cumbersome in terms of a time standpoint. What if AI could do that? What if you could actually wear a little pin? There's something called a humane pin out that's coming out soon. But there's also all sorts of other kind of programs and little gadgets you can do where basically you walk into a patient's room, the examining room, and you have a conversation with the patient, and AI actually records your conversation. The AI also generates your note for you. The AI also recommends, I've looked at the notes, lab values and such. Here's some suggested diagnoses. Your AI also writes up prescriptions for you that you can choose from and say, yep, I like this one. The AI sends it to the pharmacy, and by the time the patient goes down to the pharmacy, the prescription is ready for them to pick up. AI can help with a lot of that. What about explaining to your patient what they have? Spend a lot of time doing that, and I think we should spend more time with patients. But the AI can actually generate a much more empathetic, fulsome description than a lot of clinicians can, and evidence has backed this up that it can do that. On the other side, we have a lot of inefficiencies in our healthcare system where, because there's lack of communication, because there's a lot of manual work, can we take away that to actually free up time for people? But also, some people actually don't need to be doing what they're doing, that they can actually reskill and do things that are more productive. Absolutely. AI can take away a lot of mundane tasks. Can AI also help us understand who's going to be burnt out, who's going to quit, who's going to leave, so we can
Hmm.
retain them, so we can actually understand why they're getting burnt out? Yes. In fact, at our hospital, at Unity Health, we worked with our vice president of human resources. And what he was very excited about was, can we actually have a tool that will predict 6 months in advance, identify which areas of the hospital are going to be having high nurse turnover?
Yeah.
So we can be proactive and say, why is this happening? Are we working them too hard? Are there not enough incentives? Are the pay issues there? What is happening so we can actually circumvent the high turnover? So that tool has been up and running for a few months now
Wow.
to help us understand these patterns 6 months in advance.
And what's it producing?
It's actually producing. I would talk with the human resources folks, but they seem to like it quite a bit in terms of giving them heads up to say we're going to be in trouble in 6 months. And the reports that we're getting back is around the tools actually been incredibly helpful to say, all right, how can we investigate? How can we reduce our turnover. It'll still be a little bit of time, but what we're looking at are things like turnover metrics. So are we seeing less turnover in areas that are highlighted by the tool? Probably take another year or so to collect that data. But the hope is that we'll see more satisfied workforce, less turnover, and basically a happier, healthier group that we like engaging with.
Wow, but highly relevant. Would love to have you back and talk about that when you get a little bit further along with that. I'm sure many of our listeners and our Healthcare Can members across the country would be really interested in hearing more about themselves as well. So, um, any last words to you, Mohammed, as we close here? It's just been totally fascinating.
Although I think uh, the whole prominence of AI, it hasn't died down. I think it's becoming very real in mainstream, not only in healthcare but society at large. We use Google Maps all the time. We use Ubers, Airbnb, you name it. Practically every sector has been hit by AI. AI PCs are starting to come out now
Hmm.
with built-in AI on the device. This isn't going away. It's going to be happening. Conservative organizations or sectors like healthcare, we need to have courage, but we also need a lot of education. And I want to thank you and the podcast group for really helping society, helping deliver that message to such a wide audience, to raise the awareness, to educate people, and to prepare people for what is an inevitable future of AI in healthcare. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for so generously sharing your work, your research, your practicality of it all, and and I really do hope that it inspires others to have courage and lead in this space. Because I think, as we've been talking about, um, in many respects, we don't have any other choice. If we're talking about a system that is failing, this is going to be an incredibly important part of the solution we need to embrace.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the HQ, and I'm Dale Sherback, your host. You can find this and other future episodes on the CHA Learning website, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We'd love to hear what you think, so please follow us on our other social media channels. Thanks for joining us in this discussion today. Please join us next time.